Hi, this is Kathryn Hardin, and this part of the podcast is going to discuss what makes art so special to each individual. I am going to use 3 different pieces of art to help prove this point. Those pieces are Fly Away by Jane Cochran, Roman Empire by Paweł Kaczynski, and Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. I will also be interviewing a peer of mine on her interpretation of these pieces. Let's get started. I'm going to start with a little bit of background information about Jane Cochran and the piece Fly Away. Jane is originally from Louisville, Kentucky, but currently lives in Rappahash, Kentucky. And she is famously known for her quilting work, and one of her most famous pieces is Crossing to Freedom, which is about Martin Luther King Jr.'s freedom marches. She is famous for being a maximalist artist. This basically means that she will never see her art as being too much or too busy. She uses all of the pieces and fabrics and textures that she would like, and she thinks that's what makes her art cool, even though a lot of critics would consider it making her art pretty busy. I chose this piece, I chose this piece because of how busy it was in the first place. This is probably the 4th or 5th piece that when I was walking through the art museum, I thought, yes, I'm going to pick that one. But I came across this piece and I knew I had to do my project on it. It just has so much going on, but at the same time, it was so simple and so understandable. I went to read the little snippet or paragraph besides the art piece that all of the pieces have in the museum. And when I was reading it, it was all about Jane Cochran and the other pieces she had done. It gave little to no information about this piece, why it was made. All it gave was that it was made, or when it was made. And to me, that made it even more intriguing because this piece has so much going on and it's so meaningful and impactful to look at, yet the artist gave little to no context about what it was about. This piece is super colorful, super fun, and I think it's a compliment, but it's pretty busy. It has lots of different textures and fabrics in it. Every second you look at it, you find a cool new detail, which I think makes it so original. It is also very different from every other art piece there. It's not a painting or sculpture or a photograph. It's a quilt. Due to the lack of information that came in the little paragraph that is besides the piece, it really caused me to come up with my own meaning and my own interpretation of what this piece could possibly mean. And I think that's so cool and original to this piece as opposed to a lot of the other ones, because most of them you walk up to the little snippet that comes along with it and the artist tells you exactly what they were thinking and intending behind this piece. And while that's very cool to see their interpretation and understand it in their eyes, I think it's also really original and fun to be able to come up with your own interpretation of a piece. I argue that one of the main draws to art for people is being able to look at a piece and interpret it in your own ways. For instance, my interpretation of the piece Fly Away by Jane Cochran might be so incredibly different than yours. So when I look at this piece, I see the big bird in the middle as the person looking at the painting. So I felt like the bird was me, and all of the colorful pieces around it, such as the different fabrics and buttons, were kind of symbolizing the color and good around us and the darkness that is inside of us that can be changed by looking and seeing all the color around us. Now, since there is no real meaning behind this piece, it really can be up to your own discretion how you feel about it, but I just connected to the piece so much more because I was able to look at it and relate it to myself and how I was feeling at the time when looking at the piece. And it's not just this piece or this type of art that you can do this with. There are so many other things in art pieces that you can look at and kind of interpret in your own ways, or maybe even just find your own meanings, even though the piece probably does have its own meaning behind it that was intended by the artist. To further show this, I'm going to be discussing 2 more pieces of art that I was able to interpret in my own ways, even though these pieces have more of a meaning behind them than Fly Away by Jane Cochran. The first piece I will be discussing is Roman Empire by Paweł Kaczynski. So this piece doesn't technically have a name, and none of Paweł Kaczynski's pieces do. But as you can see by looking at the piece on your screen, it's kind of obvious about some sort of empire, and so I just interpret it as the Roman Empire. This is very different than Jane Cochran's pieces. It is a painting or drawing. He does a little bit of both in all of his pieces, and this piece is much more forward than a lot of Jane Cochran's pieces, which are very abstract. It blatantly has a building and hands and a broom And there's no mistaking that. There's no interpreting that. It's the interpretation is within what those hands are doing and what the meaning behind all of this is. So when I looked at this piece, I kind of thought of hypocrisy in government and how there are traditions that are failing and the government is kind of sweeping it under, hoping nobody will notice. They're controlling the mess, but they're not fixing the mess, if that makes any sense. So as you can see, even though this piece is kind of more in your face in a sense, you are still able to interpret it and find a meaning behind it in your own ways, which I think is really cool. And honestly, because this piece has such blatantly obvious details, it made me look at it even longer and interpret it more, because I wanted to connect all of the pieces. And I think it made this art just that much more fun to look at. The final piece I will be discussing is Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. Now, this piece is one of the most well-known pieces in the world. Pretty much everybody who's ever heard of any piece of art knows what Starry Night is, and I think they could picture it in their head if you ever brought it up. But I would like to argue that even though it is so well-known, there's still a lot of room left for interpretation. So when I look at this painting, in my mind, I see a small town in France, and it is from the point of view of somebody on the roof of the tallest building or at the top of a cliff, looking out at the town in the sky. And all of the different colors and the whimsical strokes just show how magical of a moment it was for that person looking out. Now, this is kind of, I don't know. I don't have a lot of creativity behind this thought, and I think that's okay. But I know that if somebody else were asked to explain this piece, they wouldn't come up with that exact meaning and that exact thought and that exact intent behind the colors and the brush strokes and where the person's sitting, painting this and all of that stuff. As you can see, I found my own meaning in each of these pieces, and my argument is that everyone can find their own meaning in the pieces, and that is what makes art so amazing and impactful. To further prove this argument, I have asked my friend McKenna, who's an art minor, to help interpret these pieces on her own and see what she comes up with.
Hi, my name is McKenna, and Kathryn chose me today to speak on these art pieces because I'm an art minor.
Okay, so we are going to start with Flyway by Jane Cochran. And just right off the bat, what are your initial thoughts on the piece?
Looking at this piece, I think it's very colorful and very fun to look at. I like how the artists use different colors on the piece and fabrics and patterns, and it makes it very original.
Okay, so when you look at this piece, how would you interpret it on a deeper level?
So the first thing I notice is the bird, and I think the bird symbolizes freedom. And then looking around it, the colors around it might represent personal growth or even a transition from one phase of a life to another. It also kind of makes me think of wanting to leave behind fear and self-doubt and moving on to a better version of your own self.
Okay, that's a very intriguing take. It's very different than what I thought, but I think that's really cool that you were able to think of something else. So the next piece we're going to look at is Roman Empire by Powell Kaczynski. So when you see this piece, how would you interpret it?
When I look at this piece, I immediately see the large building breaking the vase, which leads me to think it's hinting towards kind of a big business making a mess, and us or the hands in the painting are left to clean up the mess that was made.
Okay, so I looked at this piece and I saw the government as the hands, and it's cool to see that even though this piece is more forward and kind of has a more blatantly obvious meanings, the meanings people find behind it are still totally different. So the next and final piece we would be looking at is Starry Night.
Oh, I love that painting. When I went to New York, I was able to see it, and it was such a surreal feeling. When I was standing looking at it, my mind immediately went to the stars in the painting and how it looks so whimsical and freeing. It makes me think of how the sky is usually associated with heaven, and then down below, the dark town is our life here on earth.
Okay, I for sure would never have thought of that painting or saw it as that. So thank you so much for talking to us today, McKenna. Your perspective really showed how art can be so personal yet so universal all at the same time.
Thank you.
Overall, I had a lot of fun making this project and just getting to see all the different pieces of art and all the different ways that they can be interpreted and all the meanings they could have behind them. It really showed me how much fun art can be and how much art can mean to different people just based on how they feel when looking at the piece.